Hi, this is Danielle Schiel, and I'm going to go over the case study, Copyright and the Computer, Regulations Governing Technology. So to start off with a little bit of background, this occurred at St. Regis School. They offer grades K through 8. They have a population of about 420 students with 2 teachers for each grade level and 2 special education teachers, one serving K through 4 and the other 5 through 8. We have our school principal, the library media specialist, and the 3rd grade teacher, who are the main people involved. Here, I did put PTA on there because they are the ones that provided the software. So what happened is the PTA purchased a computer lab for the school. They also purchased software to use on that computer lab. And Mrs. Lynn was asked to create copies of the software to be used in the individual classrooms on single computers that are available in those classrooms. So Mrs. Lynn was handing out the software, and Mrs. Brandon received hers and said, "Whoa, I don't think that this is right. I think it violates copyright regulations." And Mrs. Lynn said, nobody else had a problem with it, so carried on. Mrs. Brandon approached Mr. Sample, the school principal, and said that she just felt really wrong about it and didn't know what to do. So Mr. Sample then approached Mrs. Lynn, who again acted like not a big deal. We even had the PTA president here, and she said, "I think this is great. We're stretching our dollars." The principal did request that all copies to be collected and to not make any more copies. So what's the law say? Well, the 1976 Copyright Act says that copying a program for educational use in a classroom is not permissible, and copying and distributing for any reason is not permissible. That's according to the University of Alabama Libraries. Some will say that there's the fair use policy, which allows software or copies to be made for educational use, but it is clearly stated that entire pieces of software cannot be copied just on the basis that they're going to be used by education. Ethical considerations. One of the comments that Mrs. Lynn said, well, who's going to even know or care? We're such a small school. Even though it is probably a pretty low cost or low price that the company would be missing out on, the copyright violations are pretty serious, and that they can come down on schools, districts, and individuals. Well, we already paid for the software is another thing that some people say, but not paying for those additional copies of software is the same thing as stealing. So my synthesis is licensed software that was purchased for a computer lab was copied in order to utilize the programs on a broader scale. So here are the facts. We've got the people that are involved. Mr. Sample, our principal, Mrs. Lynn, our library and media specialist. We have Mrs. Williams, who is the experienced 3rd grade teacher who didn't seem to have a problem with using the copied software. We have Mrs. Brandon, the new 3rd grade teacher who did have a problem using the copied software. We have the PTA who funded the purchases of the computers and software, and Mrs. Evans, who's the PTA president, who said, "I think this is great. We are stretching our dollars and saving a little bit of money." Now this happened in a rural area. It's about 25 miles from the next largest city. They only have 2 grocery stores, 1 drugstore, and a few small businesses. So our program is St. Regis School. They offer K through 8 grades, about 420 students, 2 teachers per grade, 2 special education teachers. There was no indication of elective courses or counseling, but we do know that there is little funding from state allocation, which is going to affect their budgets and how they are able to spend their money on supplemental items. So a review of the information. We know that copyright infringement could mean major fines for Mrs. Lynn, the school, and the district. I think as a principal, I would want to speak with Mrs. Evans, the PTA president, myself, to discuss the situation. Even though Mrs. Lynn said, hey, Mrs. Evans said it was fine, I think it'd be good to get that information straight from her herself. And then I would stretch that and say, well, maybe the PTA seems to be on board, but maybe they don't understand the consequences when it comes to copyright violations. From there, we would need to provide information to the PTA and other stakeholders. I would also like to speak to the superintendent or school board for support. I think that this probably could be handled at the level as long as it wasn't to a large scale or it had been happening for a long time and nobody knew about it. I think the situation is that it was caught early enough that the principal could step in and say, hey, we need to stop it. But it's always good to include those people in on the conversations if something's happening. So how can principals balance support from parents with interference with school operations? So while parents are key stakeholders and input should be welcomed, it is ultimately the principal that has the final say and the responsibility to evaluate, communicate about, and implement laws, rights, and policies and regulations to promote success and well-being for each student. So if the school district were to get fined, that would impact students, the community, all kinds of things. So some possible options, I put 4 on here. The first one is you can do nothing. Copies are going to be distributed to teachers, and it could be that no one ever finds out, no big deal, or it could be that the school is cited for a violation of copyright. The most comprehensive option would be to collect and destroy all copies and then enforce consequences if the copying continues. The first intermediate option I came up with was allow staff to keep copies that are already distributed and suggest that no additional copies be made. A possibility with that is that the schools could still be cited for violation of copyright. Intermediate option number 2 is to encourage copying and to continue the process. Again, they might not find out, or they could still be cited for violation. So evaluating the pros and cons of the first option of do nothing. The first pro would be that there's no conflict. He doesn't have to talk to anybody about stopping doing anything. And that students would have access to the programs in their classrooms, because ultimately this is all coming from, teachers wanting to do right by their students. But a con would be, could be responsible for fines if cited for copyright violation. Another con could be that there could be conflict with those teachers who are concerned about copyright violations. So Mrs. Brandon did go to Mr. Sample and say, hey, I've got an issue with this, and then maybe if nothing happens, Mrs. Brandon's not going to feel supported, and that could cause issues as well. So for the comprehensive option of collecting and destroying all copies and then enforcing consequences, the pro would be no chance of citation for copyright violation. Cons would be that students wouldn't have access to the software in their classrooms, and there could be conflict with the media specialists, parents, and staff who say, hey, we want that software in our classrooms. So for intermediate 1, where the staff who had the copies are allowed to keep them, but ask that no more should be made. So pros would be that some classrooms would have access to the software, but that takes us into the cons that the staff who did not receive the software might feel like they got left out. And obviously there would still be the chance of citation for copyright violation because there are still copies of software out there. Intermediate 2, where we just say, no big deal, keep copying, let's go for it. The pros would be all classrooms have access to the software. The money would obviously be stretched and saved. The biggest con would be that chance of citation for copyright violation. So what would I do? The best option that I would say is the comprehensive option, even though it might be the most severe. But I do suggest collecting and destroying all the copies and then enforcing consequences if copying continues. The biggest piece here is that we have to explain the consequences of copyright violation to staff, parents, and other stakeholders. And again, that's the fines that could be imposed upon any of them. In order to get that information out, you could offer a Q&A session where you'd invite people to come and talk to them, or you can send an informational letter. It's also important to explain that even if some copies are kept, it is still a copyright violation because there's copies out there that are not paid for. And again, while the cost savings is there to allow the copying, it could result in large fines. So how would I implement the decision? First of all, I think communication is the biggest piece. You need to explain the copyright laws, policies to all stakeholders, and that includes your staff, PTA, school board. Then you need to train on the policy, so staff would be provided with an acceptable use policy. A training would take place that covers that acceptable use policy, and then all staff would sign the policy stating that they will not violate any of the regulations in there, and then they also know the consequences that come along with violating that policy. Next, I would look into other resources, see if there are grants or other ways to raise funds to expand the use of software programs in the classroom. If it isn't so important that they are in the classroom, I think that there's other ways around that besides violating copyright laws. Lastly, I would follow up. I think that there should be training each year. I know it can start getting repetitive, but it's just important to get that refresher. And I also think that evaluating the use of the software programs in the classroom, we need to make sure that they truly are worthwhile, that they're being used, because I know that I've had several times where I've been handed this program and people are like, use it, and then I don't use it. So we shouldn't be spending money on things that we're not actually going to use. So I would want these policies developed. The acceptable use policy, like I said, it should be reviewed and signed each year by staff. We need to be looking at the purchasing budget situation, and this should include all input from all key stakeholders. So it can't just be a teacher saying, I want this. I think you need to look at student reviews and peer reviews, and maybe talk to parents or school board members or the community about that. An instructional team could help review the curriculum and support materials to make sure that it is worthwhile. And then lastly, an advisory committee. I have an advisory committee for my program, and it basically helps me connect with those community members and industry experts. So I am making sure that the software that I am using is relevant in preparing our students for the workforce or post-secondary readiness. And I think that the industry expert piece is really important. Myself, for example, I teach QuickBooks, and I meet with the industry experts, and they say QuickBooks is what we use, and so that's what I'm training my students to use. Here are my references, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thanks. Bye.